All right. Okay, so in the previous video, we looked at the changes to the model layers, view model, repository, and the DAO. And now let's see how they are triggered from the UI. So we have the entry details fragment, which holds a reference to the journal entry, and let's see how it's going to populate that essentially. Okay, so in the on create of this fragment, you get the view model as usual. Then you call entry ID. You try to get the entry ID from the arguments. So remember, this details fragment will be called um, uh, when you click on one of the list items in the list fragment view. Okay, so when you do that, we haven't seen that part yet, but the ID of that entry on which you clicked will be passed as an argument to this fragment. Okay, so you grab that, um, and well, I'm logging it to for sanity check basically, and then on the view model, you call load entry with that particular value. Okay, so that's the idea here. When you do that, everything else we just discussed on the previous slide that will be triggered, and you'll get the entry in the model, in the view model. Okay, yeah. So how does the fragment get the UID using a bundle as an argument? We'll see how to create that and pass it a little bit later. Um, after that, you have the on view created, which is where the view for the details fragment is going to be loaded. And in that, we are observing the view model here for the get entry live data, which was the method on the view model, if you remember, which gives the live data. And yeah, so observe has the first parameter, which should be context. Here, from a fragment, you can call get activity. Remember, activity is a subclass of context, so this works. And then the second parameter is what you should do when you observe some change. Okay, so this is the functional way of writing code. What we are saying here is when you get an entry, basically assign the entry to this dot entry, this parameter, this field over here, and then update the UI. Okay, so observe it as soon as it is created. It will lazily deliver the entry for you, store it in a reference, and update the UI. That's what we are doing after loading the UI for the details fragment. Okay. Yeah. In update UI, it's going to simply set the title and the duration in the corresponding edit text box, so the user can go and change them if he or she wants to. I won't be showing the code of this; it's fairly obvious. Okay. Then what happens when you save the entry? When you do that, you basically load the edit text value for the title into the title, um, and the duration value for the duration edit text box into the duration, and then simply call a save entry on the model, right? This is again straightforward, I hope. Um, the last sentence is curious. We are remember, in our activity, we would call finish when we are done with it. Here, if we call finish, it's going to collapse the entire activity, not just the fragment. So we need to simulate the back button. Um, Although we haven't really configured the back button yet, we'll do that later. But this is the step which will ensure that clicking the save button saves it and then also goes and closes the fragment. Okay? Basically manages the stack by popping it off and bringing the previous one up. Uh, we'll get to that code in a second. Okay, yes, now the question is who created that bundle? Who created the bundle that got the entry ID to the detail fragment? Um, and obviously it has to be the list fragment, but it's not coming directly from the list fragment. This is another roundabout way of passing data between fragments. Um, It's a bit complicated, but let's take a look at it. Um, it's very loosely coupled and good programming, good software engineering principle wise. Um, okay. So yes, the fragment is loaded in the activity, and we have the entry ID in the list fragment. Um, so this is what we are going to do. List fragment passes the entry ID to the activity, which then creates the new details fragment and passes the entry ID to that, to the details fragment. Um, and to keep the activity and list fragment loosely coupled, we implement a callback mechanism. Instead of directly sending entry ID, which can happen, won't be a big problem for a small app like ours, but best practices suggest implement callbacks like you will see here. So we are now in the entry list fragment, okay, where you are looking at those bunch of entries you have created, and we are going to add an interface callbacks with on entry selected and a UID as its parameter, and have m callbacks as a field in this class. Now, you have perhaps guessed it will be the activity who implements this callbacks on entry selected, and that's how we'll send it back there. Okay. Um, Remember, we have the view holder and the adapter, everything in the list fragment now. So in the view holder, you put a on-click listener on the item view, which is the individual view for an item. It's sent down to the view holder. And the on-click listener basically calls another method, which is going to launch the journal entry fragment in this case. And what happens in that? We simply call the on entry selected on the callbacks variable with the current entry's UID. So that's one part of the picture, where the list fragment now has managed to send the UID to a callback, which will be implemented on the activity. Yeah. So let's come to the activity now. Let's see what is happening here. It extends app compat activity as usual, but now we needed to also implement the callbacks from the list fragment. Okay. And when you do that, it's going to tell you to implement this method, which we are doing here. Now, let's see what we are doing. So far, we have only seen bundles as intent parameters or save on save bundles. But here we are creating a bundle ourselves and putting the entry ID on it. Now, remember, entry ID is not an int or a string, but it's a UUID from Java util. Okay, but it's a serializable, so you can put it on a bundle by saying put serializable. You could, of course, also convert it to a string and put it on and then convert it back, but this is more straightforward. Now, after that, just like what when we when we launch the list fragment, here we are going to create the entry detail fragment, and before putting it on the fragment manager, we are going to set argument the args for that fragment. So now um, when you're in this fragment, you can do a get arguments and get this bundle, okay, which you have actually seen already. So on the support manager, begin transaction, and instead of add, now you see a replace. So replace the fragment at this container with the new entry details fragment. Remember, you had a list fragment earlier, and we are now replacing it with this one. And then we call add to backstack and pass it a null. So this is actually a string parameter, which lets you name your stacks. Um, I don't think you'll ever want to deal with a stack. I mean, call it by name and deal with contents of the stacks yourself. So giving it a null just works fine. But if you really want to, you can give it a fancy name, and it will be your own backstack for these fragments. Okay. So to recap, you're creating the argument, putting the ID on it, and then replacing the current fragment, the list fragment, with the details fragment. So you know, um, that's where that ID is coming from, which we saw here. Mm, Here, yeah. So in the details fragment, we here we did a get arguments and get serializable and typecasted it to UUID. So this get arguments that is coming from the main activity set arguments that we just saw. So let's go over there. Okay. Yeah. So now we have completed the picture. Okay. So the list fragment, just to quickly recap, the list fragment declares a callback method on entry selected. It puts the entry ID into it, and the activity implements it as a callback. So the call is actually implemented here, in which you put it on the bundle and make that bundle as an argument of the new fragment. Okay? So that's how the picture is. The dots are connected here. Okay, we just talked about it already. So let me just go ahead. All right. So that completes the main main picture about what um, how we are connecting the fragments. Of course, there is a lot to it. There are several ways of doing things, um, and um, I'm going to share the code that I have. So you'll get the starter code, and then in the assignment, we'll add a few more things to it. But before that, let me briefly talk about this new thing in the recent version of Android Studio. They have added a database inspector, which is a tool window basically, and it lets you monitor the live updates to your database. So you can go to View Tool window and look at it. Only caveat, you need a device running API 30. So your emulator works, of course. Um, and this is a snapshot of what I had while I was developing it. Um, so there is a journal table, as you can see here. There is an ID, title, and duration. And as you add, you can see the changes right here. Okay? It's a good tool for sanity check, to see what is happening in the schema, to see if the entries are properly added, and so on. So um, feel free to take a look at this whenever you are developing. Of course, if you are running an API 30 um, device, right? Okay, so that's all about fragments. It was a bit rushed, but I think we need practice. So we'll spend some time in class if time permits. And of course, the next assignment is going to help you with it anyways. Okay. All right, so we'll stop here. And in the next one, we'll look at dialogues and option menu buttons. So that's the next one. Stay tuned. Thank you, guys.